been Superflex.
Right. Now it's time to pivot over to Superflex.
We don't have the same guys.
We don't. And it's
been controversial. I have a lot of writers who are looking at the numbers. They're looking at our tools. They're the sharpest people I know, and they want to go back with Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. And like, yeah, you can write that. That's not the way I'm playing it.
Yeah. So this is great. We have not done this before, but this year you said the first and second rounds of redraft, and you said the first round is Superflex. And I was like, oh, great. We'll get the top quarterbacks in there as well. And then I show up and you have 2 rounds of Best Ball and 2 rounds of Superflex. So I really quickly did a second round of Superflex. We didn't get we did get through your Best Ball stuff because you had Debo and Zay Flowers were the 2 main ones that jump in there with the other tight ends moving out. And you rearrange some stuff as well. You have the running backs going a little higher in Best Ball, which makes some sense, even in relation to, I guess you just have the tight ends falling is what it is, right? Yeah, you just have the tight ends falling and the wide receivers sort of coming up. So yeah, if you want to know Sean's Best Ball first 2 rounds, Brock Bowers is at 207, Trey McBride's at 209, and the other tight ends are gone and everything else is the exact same. And then Tebow is at 211 and Zay Flowers is 212. The Superflex one I thought was such a fun idea, Sean, but I had to really quickly throw together my second round. But because I thought that was fun, and I told you I had a list of just missed quarterbacks that I wanted to add in, and I just threw in a bunch of positional players to fill out the rest of it. But this was a fun addition because we never really get to include quarterbacks, but now we get to talk through the quarterbacks that we think are going to be the top quarterbacks next year, which is a really fun way of thinking through this. You just alluded to it. I start with Allen and Hurts. Now, Sean, I initially had Hurts as my QB like 5. And I was like, nah, he's going to do the tush push all again this year. And I put him back up to QB2. I do think Hurts is the one that I can see fall to the range where you have, where I think if he loses the tush push, that's a real issue. Or not even the I think they're going to still do the tush push to some degree, but I mean, loses the 15 rushing TDs is the way that I should put it. Like, I mean, that could come down in a variety of ways, including just not having so many plays at the 1 yard line. What Josh Allen did late last year with the rushing TDs under Joe Brady was very dynamic. He had I think 4 games of multiple rushing TDs. And it seemed like they were using his legs as like, in a designed way and as a huge part of their offense. I recently made him his own tier in my redraft rankings, in my quarterback redraft rankings. And I have him at the 101 here, Hurts at the 102. Sean, you have Allen at 105 and Hurts at 106. So you just alluded to this. Before we get to your top 4, talk a little bit about Allen and Hurts in particular, some of the fragility with their profile.
One of the reasons to do these exercises is so that people can make fun of you at the time and then also later when you're obviously wrong. Right? You get made fun of now, get made fun of in the future. One of the things I do like to do with it, though, is think through things that I might not be comfortable with, that are not priced in, that even if I'm wrong, and I'm wrong a lot, it helps me price all of the different players. And so you mentioned the concerns with Hurts. That's basically the concern that I have there. I think he has to emerge as a more dynamic passer, and they have to fix the problems they had last year where they didn't use, they haven't used Devontae Smith enough. He's dominated in camp. I think that he could be that guy. We just got done talking about T. Higgins could vault. I think Devontae Smith could. But Hurts has to pass the ball better than he did a year ago. They have to structure it better, and he's got to get the ball to A.J. Brown. And as these guys get older, and there's always this tension because, like, they're not old, right? But it's in the same way that running backs are not old. Being able to maintain the hybrid, it's not just being a hybrid scorer. You've got to maintain the hybrid upside that comes with 15 touchdowns. And I think that when the scoring falls for those guys from 22 to 23 at the same time that they hit these 15 touchdown seasons, And then they have some additional concerns for Josh Allen, it being a team that doesn't have a lot of talent at receiver and is probably going to be a little bit more run based. For Hurts, it's the collapse that they had last season, and that you might lose some of that offensive line dominance that was so important to the rushing value that he had. If I'm seeing scoring drop at the same time that you get this massive touchdown spike that almost certainly is unsustainable, then I'm looking at that and saying, not that these guys aren't going to be good. I have them all ranked ahead of any position player. And one of the things that I emphasize a lot in all Superflex formats is that quarterbacks are generally mildly underrated or mildly overrated. And so anybody that I have above the position players, I still have a very high grade on. But for me, I think that we have two passing QBs that have the potential to set all of the records. And we have two rushing QBs that actually offer more interesting hybrid profiles with more upside in perhaps both elements, but certainly more upside on the rushing portion of it.
So we alluded to me having Mahomes far too low for where I had Xavier Worthy and Rashee Rice ranked in the redraft one. That's one of the pocket passers, obviously. We do have the same top 6, despite me having Allen and Hurts 1-2 and you having them 5-6. And so that for you have Jayden Daniels as a Superflex 101 next year, followed by Lamar. And then Stroud and Mahomes are the two pocket passers that you mentioned that are going to absolutely light the world on fire. I go Allen, Hurts, Lamar. And when I said I had Hurts back a little bit, I had Lamar ahead of Hurts first. And I kind of feel like I probably should have left it that way. I think Lamar is maybe the play this year. And I actually recently moved him ahead of Hurts. I don't know why I have Hurts as the 102 here, because I moved him ahead of Hurts in my redraft rankings. It's more or less just an oversight by me. You know what it is I put off the Superflex until right before our show, and then the Tyrone Tracy injury happened, and I went through the Superflex really quickly because the Tyrone Tracy thing really broke me. So I'm just gonna tell you right now, I don't stand by this at all. Anyway, Allen, Hurts, Lamar, flip those two. Stroud, Jayden Daniels, and Mahomes for me. Daniels, Lamar, Stroud, Mahomes, Allen, Hurts. For you, we've talked a lot about the Mahomes and Stroud stuff. Shawn, I'm really curious to hear how Jayden Daniels becomes the 101.
It goes back to, so I did this fun series. It was the Rookie 101 series where I profiled 6 different guys, 5 different guys, 6 different guys. And the only one at this point that doesn't feel legitimate to me anymore is Drake May. The other 5 players all have a little bit of that generational element to them. I think Brock Bowers was the best prospect. Obviously, there are some reasons why tight ends might be knocked down a little bit. You and I both had Neighbors ahead of Harrison. I think people are really on board with the idea that those two guys are very, very good. You look at Caleb Williams in that first preseason game, and he looks like he was advertised as a Patrick Mahomes who is probably going to run more. And we both have him at the 108 with different players in between. But the guy there who is riskier, and yet specifically for fantasy football, and I keep going back to Anthony Richardson, who I have here at the 110, that is about where he's going this year. But Jayden Daniels, as a collegiate player, was a better runner than Richardson. And he was kind of in that range where you have Lamar Jackson, and then way down, you have everybody else. But in between there, you could have Jayden Daniels. And you can look back over multiple seasons. You can look at it as from a designed run perspective, from a scramble perspective. You can break down scrambles into pressured and non-pressured. In all of those environments, Jayden Daniels is extraordinary. one of the things I was kind of hoping was that he wouldn't score a rushing touchdown in the preseason game because we don't need his price blown up. The human thing is just that, you kind of want to see it once before you completely buy in, because otherwise there's this chance you're just completely wrong. They run all of these plays where Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson aren't able to get in. It's not necessarily on the backs. It's the way some of those goal line plays will work. You don't get it perfectly blocked. Neither Eckler nor Robinson are unreal. They get stuffed. They run it over and over. Like, then why couldn't one of those guys have just gotten in? Because then you see Jayden Daniels fake it and run in with no one around him. And you're like, oh, I mean, it's not that he's going to lead the NFL in rushing touchdowns. We just had Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen score 15. We're coming off of a season where Anthony Richardson barely played any minutes and scored 4. Right? Those guys could still gap him. And yet he is in the range where he could put up a lot of rushing touchdowns. If you look at his history, the only way that he doesn't put up a lot of rushing yards is if he gets hurt. And I think that the difference between him and the other hybrid quarterbacks in that category, I think, is overstated when you consider that, Hurts and Allen have played through some injuries, and they've probably also gotten a little bit lucky. Obviously, Richardson, Kyler, and Lamar Jackson have had seasons ruined. If Jayden Daniels gets hurt in the first quarter of week 1, it'll be devastating. It also wouldn't have been a situation where that was inevitable, right? And it's almost a case where the inevitability of an injury for him is the only thing keeping his ADP even remotely in check. Because the other thing that you have now, the other thing I want to point out is, like, why couldn't De'Ami Brown have dropped that ball?
Mm-hmm.
Because it was a great catch. It was a very, very good pass. But if you don't get the great catch, then everybody's not like, oh, look, there's the vertical element that we got last year in college. It was unfortunate from a price perspective that he immediately showed the two things that make him the best fantasy profile for a quarterback that exists now in the NFL. Now, a month from now, I'm probably going to say, why did he just make those 2 plays in the preseason game and now he's not scoring in real football? That's always a possibility, right? He's a rookie.
Yeah, but I love the way you put that. He's a very unique element. And Shawn, for the offseason, for most of the offseason, you and I have talked a little bit about him versus Anthony Richardson and how people are really buying into Richardson because of a 2 2/3 game sample. When I did my projections, my numbers on both of them came out very similar. And that was after I got a little pushback about where I had ranked or how I had projected Richardson's rushing yardage. And so I really elevated Richardson's designed run rate, which I don't know that I actually love, because there's this really important element to the rushing upside that's design run and scramble. And if you go dig into this stuff in college, Richardson didn't scramble a lot, didn't take a lot of sacks either. He's a certain type of quarterback, gets the ball out. Daniels takes some sacks. He also scrambled at massive rates at all times throughout all the different years that he played in college, because he played at Arizona State before LSU. There's a long college history, and it's like at times like double what Richardson did. And Richardson basically had like the 1 year as a starter. But Daniels is scrambling at such a higher rate, didn't have as much of a designed element, and he's smaller. And maybe that isn't a part of it that we should figure in. And Steichen likes to do the design runs since the Eagles days. And so I get the Richardson side of that, but I do think it's pretty important to point out that the scramble stuff, and along with the sack rate and holding the ball and being a playmaking type of quarterback, is who Daniels is relative to Richardson. And then the design run rate is what their coaches are willing to call. There's a difference there in terms of like what the ceiling is. Because if the Commanders, for some reason, decide they want to start calling a lot of these read options like they did at the red zone or at the goal line, and he scored that rushing TD, then suddenly Daniels has the ability to be in Lamar Jackson territory, basically. And we've in terms of the rushing yardage, that's something, and I always like to emphasize there's different layers, right? Lamar, 2019, when he broke out, had 1,200 rushing yards. He became the second guy ever to have 1,000 rushing yards, right? Only Michael Vick had done that. And then he comes back and he does it again the very next season. He has 1,000 rushing yards. He's had over 760 2 years since then, where he only played 12 games in those years. If you go to his yards per game, it's a little bit down from the 1,000-yard seasons, but not way down. And his 1,000-yard seasons were in 15 games. And then last year, it came down a little bit more for him. He was at 51 yards per game last year. He had been 63 to 67 the 3 years prior. Go back to 2019, we had the 1,200 yards. He was at 80 yards per game. So He's gone from 80 all the way down to 50 over these 4 to 5 years, and maybe isn't that same player. Daniels is in that young part of his career. We know as guys age, they maybe run a little bit less, right? Daniels in that same young part of his career where I think you can make the case, and you basically just did that. I mean, if his rushing and those scramble rates and all that stuff manifest like it did for early Lamar, you could be in the 75 rush yards per game range. You could be at 1,100 rushing yards, right? Even if he's not going to run for 15 TDs, his rushing yardage, and I was comparing him just directly to Richardson, who I think will have a strong rushing yardage total as it goes for a quarterback, but Richardson might land in the Hurts and Allen range, which is more like 600 to 700 yards. And I think Daniels has a better case to be an 1,100 yard rusher than Richardson. And then you also talked about the vertical passing element. And so when you said that perfect profile for the modern NFL, I think a lot of people are thinking that's Richardson right now. Very intriguing to hear you talk through Daniels on that level. And when I went through this exercise, I felt the same way. That's why I ranked him 105. Shawn, we both have Richardson in the last few picks of our first round, still a clear first round pick. But for me, this was saying that I do think he probably underwhelms his ADP in most scenarios this year a little bit. And it's similar to what we talked about with how I dropped Marvin Harrison, where people then say he's worse than he is because of, some underwhelming elements. But in this preseason game 1, you were talking about Daniels. Daniels completely misses a screen on the first pass, but that's not his game. We don't want him to throw screens. And he throws a really nice ball in the deep shot. And you said it was a nice catch. Very limited sample, but we saw some of that. For Richardson, I was concerned with some of his throws in preseason week 1.
They don't look good, but again, the coaching, the weapons, if you hit on the vertical ones. I mean, he had the game that was 11 for 25 last year, but there were 200 yards and I believe multiple passing touchdowns.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he's not going to be bad, but I think where he goes at QB5 probably helps explain why we have him a little bit lower. So I mentioned the top 6. We have the same top 6 quarterbacks, a little bit of a different order. You have Justin Jefferson. Go ahead.
I had mentioned the article. I've kind of been going back and forth. I want to read these numbers because they're so absurd. I think the listeners will enjoy these. In 2023, Daniels rushed for 1,134 yards and 10 touchdowns in 12 games. In 2022, Daniels rushed for 702 yards after contact, the highest total since Jackson's 2017 season, and 11 touchdowns in 14 games. In 2021, Daniels posted a 33.6 evasion rate, a number that trails only Richardson from 2022, which was 38%, and Jackson from 2017 among QBs with at least 100 carries since 2017. In both 2022 and 2023, Daniels posted an evasion rate above 50% and a stuff rate below 5% on scrambles, right? So specifically scrambles. In each of the last 3 seasons, he averaged more yards per game from this category than Richardson did in 2022, which obviously you compare it to 2022 because that was the Richardson breakout season, culminating with a 28 yards per game edge in 2023. In 2022 and 2023, Daniels averaged at least 30 yards per game on non-pressure scrambles. In both 2022 and 2023, Daniels averaged at least 30 yards per game on designed runs, and in each season, he averaged 3.3 yards after contact per attempt and scored 9 touchdowns. And then Richardson's 2022 was similar to Daniels' 2022 in terms of per game yardage in this category, and he averaged 2.7 yards after contact per attempt and 7 touchdowns. So again, the idea there is, number one, those numbers are crazy. Number two, it kind of helps you calibrate to some of the guys that we think about in terms of Lamar Jackson and Anthony Richardson. And then number three, again, that emphasis on all of the different categories he excels in. And so even if the coaching staff somehow dampened his numbers in one of them, I mean, he would just have to be a completely different player at the NFL level to not post extreme numbers as a rusher in the 2024 season.
And I mentioned the scramble stuff. You gave a lot of great numbers there too, but I have these real quick as well. That last year he was a 13.5% scramble rate. That's per drop back. 2022, 13.9%. 2021, 14.5%. All the way back in 2019, before the pandemic, right? Because the 2020 season he barely played. They didn't play a lot of games. I think he was still ASU, 15.2%. So he was between 13.5% and 15.2% all 4 seasons where he had meaningful volume all 4 years. It's a pretty consistent rate. Richardson's 1 year that you mentioned, that 2022 season, he was at an 8.5% scramble rate. So quite a bit lower, 5 percentage points lower than Jayden Daniels' lowest season, even after years of like poise in college, was still a 13+% scramble guy. And Richardson went to the NFL last year, was at 7.1% in that very small sample. His rushing last year was largely designed. And I've talked about how both of his injuries came on design runs. I'm not saying they're not going to use him on design runs, but I do think there's a little bit of a concern with Richardson's rushing volume being scaled back by his team when his own scramble rate is in the 7 to 8% range and Jayden Daniels is in this 15% range. I mean, it's double. It's so, I mean, gets back. And you were talking about also, evasiveness and the yards that he was actually gaining and some of the efficiency, I'm just talking about that one stat about the scramble, like the volume of rushes. I do think Richardson's going to have a meaningful number more of designed runs. I do think you should expect that, but I think he needs that just to have the same type of rushing upside that Daniels has. That's all relevant to the fact that Richardson goes higher than Daniels in drafts. It's all relevant to the fact that we both have Daniels ranked higher going into next year, because the way that this rushing stuff manifests is going to very much impact cost next year. So we had the same 6 quarterbacks.
And there's a very, I think, legitimate concern too about Daniels as a passer. If you think about him being a 5th-year breakout who had Malik Neighbors as a catalyst, the thing I would throw out to put that in a little bit of context is that back in 2019 as a freshman, he averaged 9.4 adjusted yards per attempt and had a 17-2 touchdown to interception ratio playing for Herm Edwards. Right off the bat, he was fine. There were some things that happened in the interim that caused the unique path and made it so that he, ends up winning the Heisman Trophy as an older player in 2023. But the passing was there right off the bat. And the ability to protect the football.
So we have the same 6 QBs. Richardson falls at QB 8 for you. He falls at QB 9 for me. The guy that you have in between there is one of my 2 in between there as well. It's Caleb Williams. Not much of a surprise. He's got an incredible cast, and we think he's going to scramble a little bit more than people think. Basically, that his passing numbers and some rushing will outdo Richardson rushing more, but not having the same type of passing. The other guy I have in there is Kyler. And I mentioned on our redraft show wanting to talk to you about Kyler because you have Trey McBride 111 and Marvin Harrison 201. You got me on Xavier Worthy at 201, Rashee Rice at 202, and not being high enough on Mahomes. You don't have Kyler coming in until the 201. He's your QB 10. I have him as my QB 7 at 107. You talked about a little bit of concern about his actual passing. I thought that was interesting because I think his passing gets a bad rap. He was, obviously a 2-sport athlete, a high school star, one of the most efficient college passers of all time, had a couple of the most efficient college passing seasons of all time, and then developed pretty quickly at the NFL level, I thought. In year 2, had some really strong passing numbers. That's still to this day his best passing season, 3,971 yards, 26 touchdowns, strong 67% completion percentage. Year 3 starts really good for him, and that's 2021. It's been a while now, but he was in the MVP discussion at the start of 2021. He started with 4 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns. He had 2 a couple weeks later, then 4 and 3 again. And in that first 7 games, he had 3 touchdowns 4 times. He was completing over 70% of his passes. He was an absolute star. And then in week 8, what happened is he hurt his knee. This is the year that he sprained his knee. He missed 3 games. He was completing 73.5% of his passes. This is like when they had AJ Green. He was elevating bad players, massive yards per attempt. He hurts his knee the next week, misses the next 3 games, comes back early. And I still remember this game against Chicago. I'm looking at the game log now, but I remember they only threw 15 passes. They basically had him out there playing hobbled because they had actually started that year 7-0 as well. They started as well as he was playing, they were winning their games as well. So he gets hurt, he misses some time, but he rushes back because they're in a playoff hunt, right? And then he plays compromised the rest of that year. Numbers still okay, but not great. The next season, he's not quite on the same level in the first half of the year. They're definitely not 7-0. They're losing some games. Hurts is something again, misses a couple games, comes back, and then tears the ACL. And then the next season was last year. He missed the whole first half rehabbing that torn ACL, played late in the year. So we have, that early 2022 part I don't want to ignore because it wasn't as good as the early 2021 part. But we do have compromised seasons in the last 3 years, I will say, which is an important part of the Kyler Murray equation. And yet I do think right now in fantasy, it is keeping people away from this, what his specific upside can look like. And if Trey McBride and Marvin Harrison are good, and if Drew Petzing, who I think is the really big key to this, who I thought did a really good job with Josh Dobbs last year, he's their first-year offensive coordinator last year. And I thought down the stretch last year that Kyler, while working back from an ACL, played under Petzing pretty effectively as well. If Petzing is the upgrade on Cliff Kingsbury, that I think that Kyler maybe has been held back by Kingsbury. And maybe I think people that's why I referenced the high school and the college stuff. And the fact that he's had spurts at moments, but then they've also had times where they're too predictable. And there's a lot of film watchers, a lot of people that have criticized Kingsbury's offenses with Kyler Murray as too predictable. The horizontal raid, not pushing it enough, not using Kyler's skills enough. He was their coach all through that, and an embattled coach that people talked about firing at times, but never happened. He does finally get fired. Kyler last year gets to play under the new coaching staff in a rehab year late last year, but goes into this year with another offseason of studying the playbook and getting to know everything. There's a part of me that thinks Kyler Murray could have a really huge season this year. Clearly, I'm setting that up. I'm ranking him at 107 going into next year. I think the rushing could be really back as he's healthier again, assuming he can stay healthy, but that the weapons are probably the best that he's had his whole career. And the system is certainly, in my opinion, the best that he's had in his whole career. And I think it really does set up for a strong year for Kyler Murray.
So I think that is.
I want to throw out one last note. He's 26 right now. He turns 27, I think, this month or very soon. I remember looking this up. Oh no, sorry. He literally just turned 27 last week. So he's 27 here in August, but came into the league young, has played a lot of years, but like sometimes quarterbacks need a little time to develop and all that. Like this is for a lot of quarterbacks, age 27-ish range is like just getting into your prime. Not like, I think we think of Kyler as like old and over the hill almost. He's injury prone and he's, falling off, but I think there's room for him to actually have a strong 3 to 5 year peak that starts now.
I think that's all very much in play. Some of the concerns that I would have for him would be probably unfair because they're looking at things like last year where, his numbers in terms of adjusted yards per attempt, IQR, which is the adjusted SIS quarterback rating, their numbers for him in terms of points earned per play, things like EPA, all of those paint him as an average quarterback. That's when you're having to go in there and play off of an injury, which is a little bit unfair. I do think that there is reason to be concerned about all of the injuries that he's had and what that means for the trajectory, not in the same way as a Deshaun Watson, but from the perspective of realizing the injuries are problematic, that missing a lot of time over multiple seasons, it isn't something where it just goes back to where they were before all of that happened. And it's also the case that it's not just whether or not they can get to 100% physically, because you've missed a lot of reps, you've gotten older, you're in a different place with who you are now than where you were before from a reps perspective. in terms of how much you have played recently and just even who you are as a person, all of those types of things. And I think a little bit of my frustration with it may actually be Cliff Kingsbury's fault. But as an Arizona Cardinals fan, it's been hard to watch him play, both from a running style, which isn't very dynamic even when he's able to generate this hybrid profile, and from a passing perspective, where there are these echoes of Russell Wilson, not necessarily in the specifics, because he's a better passer in some ways than Russell Wilson. But again, I mean, for Russell Wilson, part of it was just that once he lost some of that athleticism, it was no longer there. I mean, Russell Wilson was, for a while, one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks in the entire NFL. I have concerns about what Kyler can truly do in a more normal NFL offense. So while at the same time that I think Kingsbury didn't maximize what he could do, I don't know that a more traditional offense is the solution either. But the main thing is just that I like some other guys here. And so when I have him a little bit lower and I have him at the 201 just behind Jordan Love, partly that's saying that Caleb Williams, Anthony Richardson, and Jordan Love, I think, are better plays, but all somewhat together. And then the couple of, I've included 3 receivers. I think those receivers are going to be good. And when we think about the structure of Superflex, I think I mentioned this earlier, but quarterbacks are a little bit overvalued. And so you can play those receivers and then have Murray slide in that area. There is an element where when you compare him to Jordan Love, the player I have just higher, and we kind of had this conversation when we drafted our BBT team live the other day as well, where I was kind of pushing you to allow us to take Love so we could then backstack him with Dontavian Wicks. Jordan Love will have to be much better than Murray. And so anytime that you're setting up a dynamic where the guy you have ranked higher has to also play a lot better just to hit the ranking you already have, that does set you up potentially to fail. But I just think Jordan Love is going to be fantastic, and I think Kyler Murray is going to be fine. And so if that is the thesis on how they will play, I want Love. And I also think Love is going to add just enough rushing value to not be a hybrid QB, but to not be in that mix that I think we talked about on last week's show when we were looking through rankings and that type of thing, where Love is going to add enough, he's going to score enough, and that Packers offense is going to be so exciting for fantasy managers that I think they're going to really want a part of it. Now, maybe with Marvin Harrison and Trey McBride, the same thing will be said at this point next year for the Arizona Cardinals as well.
So you have Kyler, like you said, at 201 as your QB 10. And the 3 names that you have between there are Caleb Williams, Anthony Richardson, and Jordan Love. I have those guys in that order behind Kyler as far as the QBs are concerned. And so we have the same top 6 and then ultimately the same top 10 as well. I'm just pushing Kyler ahead of Caleb, Richardson, and Love. You have him behind those 3. Both very high on Caleb. I don't know if we necessarily need to talk about him a ton. You've talked favorably about Love quite a bit. You have Jefferson, Garrett Wilson, and Lamb interspersed in that first round in the back half. I have my top 3 from the redraft show, Bijan, Breece Hall, and Lamb interspersed there as well. And then as we go into the second round, my 202 is Trevor Lawrence, who you don't have listed anywhere. My 203 is Joe Burrow. You have Joe Burrow at 203. Burrow is one that I feel like I'm not giving enough credit to this offseason. At the same time, I don't know that the rushing is really going to be huge. It'll be some. I've been talking about it. I think T. Higgins is going to hit. They're going to replace Tyler Boyd's routes with other good players. I don't want to be out on Burrow, but part of the reason I put Lawrence there is that Lawrence does have a little bit more of a rushing profile than Burrow. And I've talked through this a lot, but Lawrence's career high in pass TDs is only 25. The thing that's really got me going on Lawrence, the more I talk about him, I've been asked about him recently. I got asked about him in my Reddit AMA yesterday, Sean. And I went through his profile last year is he basically was Jordan Love and Brock Purdy last year, except the passing TDs. It really, and then, excuse me, with more rushing though, as well for Lawrence. And Love and Purdy were the QB5 and QB6 last year. So they had 4,160 and 4,280, that 4,100 to 4,300 pass yards, 32 and 31 TDs. Love had more rushing, 247 and 4. Purdy had 144 and 2. Purdy's the one who had a little bit more passing numbers. Love finished higher. Lawrence last year was at 4,016 passing yards, not quite as high. He also missed a game. Purdy missed a game as well. So, but in terms of, per game passing, right there with Love, certainly a little bit behind Purdy. Only the 21 TDs, but he had 339 rush yards, which is about 100 more than even Love and a couple hundred more than Purdy. 4 touchdowns. Lawrence has always been, for rushing TDs, he's always been in that 300 range at least, or just above 300. With the rushing, he's in the low 4,000s in passing there. I do think he has the potential to add some passing yards. The key for me is he was 10 passing TDs behind last year. He only threw 21 last year, which is just wild. He threw 25 in year 2. Obviously, year 1 was the Urban Meyer year. I just don't buy that he's going to be in the low 20s in pass TDs. I think he's going to be, the way that I put it is I think his 50th percentile is a career high. I think it's in the 27 to 28 range probably, where like the 25 and especially the 21 was just him in these couple years since the Urban Meyer year, which I more or less throw out mentally, which isn't fair, but I do. But the 2 years since that he's been in the 25th percentile of his outcomes, he's just hit a couple below average outcomes for the past TD stuff. He's thrown some picks in the end zone, made some dumb mistakes, right? But he had that one playoff game in this stretch as well, where he was way behind and he ends up throwing 4 TDs to come back. A game like that in the regular season would really help this type of a thing. It's just not strung together for him, but past TD rate is one that is a more fluid stat, not particularly sticky. It can spike. He's got some new weapons. I like him, Sean, to bounce back into the high 20s in past TDs and have a 30-plus pass TD season at some point in his career. And if he does that and keeps the 300-plus rushing yards that I mentioned, where he's actually adding a little more value with his legs than those 2 guys I comped him to, he's basically the QB5. I mean, that's where he can get to in a good season for him.
And I don't have him in, and I think that is just completely wrong. Trevor Lawrence is just hard for me because it's a similar thing where I watch him play and there are so many things I wish he would do differently. Which, if that's your takeaway when you watch someone and then they don't have some of the things that make them a clear superstar, you're like, it's easy to avoid that player. But one of the things but we can make this very simple, right? Which is one of the things I've referenced a number of times is that you have a guy in a Jordan Love where in the second half of his first season actually getting to play, he was absolutely electric, right? So we think about where he could go, and from week 11 to week 18 on, which is cherry picked because it's when his numbers really jump, but it's also the final 8 games of his rookie season, so it's more or less half and half. He's the number 3 QB on a points per game basis behind Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and he has guys that we feel very comfortable drafting earlier, like Jalen Hurts and Patrick Mahomes, not just beaten, but gapped. Well, if I'm going to be so focused on that, then with the guy who comes in 4th is Trevor Lawrence. He comes in 4th over the second half of last season, and for him, it's 7 games, not 8. But in a season where he looked terrible, where the coaching staff made a bunch of mistakes, where the receivers didn't come through for him, where he didn't throw the touchdowns, like you're saying, and now they have improved the weapons. The problem for me is as I'm trying to build teams, I still don't like where the weapons are priced.
I know.
So then you end up not really wanting Trevor Lawrence. But I believe it was last night I was in a marathon draft. And so I'm far less concerned about how I'm doing the stacking in that format. And he falls well below ADP. And I'm like, I'm going to take this guy just by himself and feel like this is a huge win. So I think that the way you've described it with Trevor Lawrence, I mean, if he can score at that level when everything is going wrong, he's very well set up to beat ADP for this season and to be very much in that mix where you have him or higher when we talk about Superflex next season.
Yeah, and there's a lot of people. I get the question for home leagues that are like, you guys always talk about stacking for best ball and all this stuff, and you play in the main event and you play in these big tournaments. I get questions from people that they're like, I'm literally anti-stacking because I think I have an edge over my league mates, and I'm in a 12-team league and I want to spread out my bets. Lawrence is the QB. I mean, not like Daniels is the QB if you can get Daniels at a good discount, but Lawrence is that's a situation where he's a really nice fall. Like, I think Caleb Williams is probably the best fallback for Daniels, but then Lawrence is the fallback to those two. But like you said, that I don't get as much of him as I want to either, because his weapons are priced in some tricky ranges. Ingram's right behind the elite tight ends and probably isn't an elite profile. Kirk's really pushed up there. Brian Thomas is the one that has started to slide, and I think you can mix in for sure. Gabe Davis probably overpriced for what he is. But if you're in a 12-team home league where you're not really worried about stacking, that's where it's like, then Lawrence, I think, becomes a little bit of a priority along with those rookies in that range. But he's a target for me in redraft, tougher in the best ball stuff, like you said, sometimes to build out those Jacksonville stacks, which I think makes him somebody that I want to more intentionally do, because probably other people are having that issue. I hear you say that, and I feel the same way. We both have Burrow at 203. So by the time we hit the 203 here, you and I both had 9 quarterbacks in the first round, and then our 10th at 201. I mentioned Evan Lawrence at 202 and Burrow 203. You have another non-QB, Bijan at 202, Burrow 203. But, those top 15 picks, one of the things I noticed when I went through this and went through the first round, I have my first 8 picks are all QBs. I was feeling like, and this is why it's so fun that you decided that we should do this year too, because we have all of these profiles this year where I feel like QBs are going to hit, right? It's a deep position now. I mean, you bring in these young mobile quarterbacks, and then Stroud with the pocket passing, and now we have Caleb, and we have Jayden, and we had Richardson, and Love hit last year, and obviously Stroud hit last year. There's this really fun depth to the quarterback position now where I just wanted to emphasize we both have 9 quarterbacks in the top 12, and then also are hitting quarterback at 201, and then you're hitting at 203. I have Lawrence there at 202 as well. We're still piling them in the early second round as well. So for the top 15 picks, you got 11. I got 12 quarterbacks. We do think the position is going to be, hammered in Superflex next year, and really be you need to get into these early tiers at quarterback early, even before some of the skill players. From there, we both go to our next ranked non-skill players. I won't go into them a ton. We talked about them in the redraft sections. For the most of the rest of the second round, I throw Dak Prescott later in the second round as my last QB. You go, I have him at 208. You go several picks, and then at the very end of the round at 211 and 212, you have Dak Prescott at 212. The other quarterback that you sneak in here that I don't have. Do you want to tell the people who it is, Sean? You're laughing.
Ben, what are we supposed to take away from Justin Fields' first preseason game there? Did he look good? Did he look bad? Is he rising? Did he lose the chance?
He looked like Justin Fields, Sean. He looked like Justin Fields. He took a couple sacks. He fumbled some snaps, but he also got, look, I felt like there, I guess you saw what you wanted to see. There's a lot of people that were like, this is can't do it. Can't happen. He fumbled 2 snaps. He took 2 sacks. This is why Justin Fields can't play. I was like, man, I don't know what people were expecting. I certainly wasn't expecting him to be a different quarterback the first time that we saw him on a new team. I did feel like he got a couple perimeter throws out to George Pickens quickly and on time. And I wrote that in my preseason week 1 write-up. He had a nice pass down the field. You saw the accuracy. I don't know, what about, Fields, the big question just always remains, is the pocket awareness, is the tendency to hold the ball too long a fatal flaw that keeps away all of the rest of his skill set, the mobility, the accuracy, because he has everything else. If you could protect him, or if he could protect himself, get the ball out, he has all the other traits. But can he process quick enough? Whatever it is, can he get the ball out of his hand, or is he going to take too many sacks? You've got him having a good year this year and being right back in the second round in Superflex next year, which with the way he scores, if he plays most of the year for Pittsburgh and they're good, and let's say they go whatever, 9-8. They're projected to be something like 500. And Fields is their starting quarterback again next year. I mean, yeah, he probably would go 211 in Superflex.
I'll throw this out, not because I want people to think that I believe these two players should be anywhere in the same range, but just again, as we try and calibrate our expectations and understand scoring, Dave Caban has a range of outcomes tool up on the site, which is fantastic as long as you're using it correctly, right? As long as you're thinking through what it means, which is that these are historical player matches, and historical player matches are going to be more accurate for some profiles than others. That's kind of a big picture note on it. But one of the cool things is it has the FFPC Superflex scoring settings. And this is another sort of note for anybody playing Superflex, is to make sure you understand how your league works, because I play with some leagues with Ryan McDowell where the scoring for passing QBs is not mitigated. And some of those passers are absolutely fantastic. There are a lot of Superflex formats that actually knock down that passing value. I think, Ben, you and I were making a decision last night about how to start the going deep format that Mike Clay runs, that you and I have a lot of fun participating in every year. And the passing scoring in that is knocked down. And so we went a different way in round one as opposed to taking a QB. But in the FFPC Superflex version, when you take Mahomes and Fields and compare them, and again, this method uses the last two seasons with an emphasis on the most recent season. It's using historical player matches. It's giving you a range of outcomes. Justin Fields looks better than Patrick Mahomes. That doesn't mean that he's going to score like that. Doesn't mean any of those things, right? But it just reinforces this idea that someone who has 1,000-yard rushing upside at a quarterback position in Superflex is and remains a cheat code in a way that other players simply cannot be.
So that's the Superflex first two rounds, Sean. Fields sneaks in there at 211. I didn't read all the non-QBs, but the way your QBs situated: Daniels, Jackson, Stroud, Mahomes, Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts. You had them 1 through 6. Caleb Williams, 108, Anthony Richardson, 110, Jordan Love and Kyler Murray at the turn, Joe Burrow, 203. So kind of sprinkling in some non-QBs through the 203. And then Fields and Dak at the end of round 2. I went Allen, Hurts, Lamar, Stroud, Jayden Daniels, Mahomes, Kyler, Caleb as the first 8 picks. Threw in 3 non-QBs, then went Richardson, Love, Lawrence, Burrow as my sort of next tier at the 112 through 203. And then Dak later in the second round as well. So we actually had some pretty big similarities, and then also some micro differences within sort of the tiers and some of those elements. I was a little higher on Kyler. You certainly really pushed Jayden up to 101. Some of the rest of it, not so different, really. I was maybe lower on Mahomes than I should be relative to where I ranked Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy and some of that stuff. And obviously, I had Lawrence in there. You had Fields in there. Those were our one big difference. But both had Love right at the 1-2 turn. Both had Burrow at 203. Both had Dak in the back part of round 2. So that's the way we see the Superflex position shaping out next year. I thought, yeah, the big takeaway when you think about the positional stuff, we talked through the redraft stuff, that you were really in on the receivers to continue to push up. We also are really in on this quarterback position continuing to push up. And I think the takeaway for that, if you're not in Superflex and you're playing in redraft, is that there's a lot of guys here that we think are going to be in with the top scorers next year, which is the no elite QB thing that we have talked about, that you've talked about. I'm not taking a lot of elite QBs in best ball or in other formats. That's not because we don't think Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and those guys are going to score points. In fact, I'm like, especially like Lamar, I think he could have a massive year. It's because Kyler's a little bit later, right? Jayden Daniels a little later than that. Caleb Williams later than that. Jordan Love is back there. Joe Burrow, Trevor Lawrence, we talked about. There are a lot of dudes that show the type of potential that if they hit this year, they could be right up with those guys next year. We think they could score like that, and you get to draft them later. So then you don't want to draft the early ones because it's better to draft later. Doesn't mean you want to be completely out at QB in all situations. I've talked about it in my home league write-up over at the newsletter at Stealing Signals, BenGretch.substack.com. Long home league write-up, added some, auction thoughts and Superflex thoughts and all that stuff. Talked about how, because there's softer rooms, I always get asked the question about, I can get receiver depth. You have more detours. You're almost looking for detours. You have to, prioritize the strength of that starting lineup. We've talked about it before on the show as well in past years. So yes, sometimes you do go out and draft Josh Allen in a home league because you're like, nothing else I can do with this pick. I'm going to get 9 million good receivers anyway. So, yeah, we still rank those guys high. I still have Josh Allen in a tier of his own. That's the top quarterback for this year. But Shawn, this was a blast. This was, I guess we could talk about near misses. Was there any quarterbacks? Like I almost put Drake May on here. Like if we get a good second half of the year, I definitely think he would be here. In all likelihood, with his profile, if they show out at all, he'll probably get landed in here, right?
Didn't you have Drake May in?
I did at one point, and then I was kind of tweaking it because I did that second round like as we were starting the show. I was kind of tweaking it. I pulled him out. I had him at 212 for a moment. So that's why I mentioned him. He was definitely in my near misses. We like Bo Nix a lot, Shawn. I thought about him, but he doesn't really make sense to me to, like, from a scoring profile perspective, to go that high next year. Neither of us had Purdy in there. But, again, feels like kind of capped on the volume sense, probably not going quite that high. Maybe he would sneak into the second round. Tua, Goff, Cousins, Herbert, Aaron Rodgers, those kinds of guys are probably not. I'm looking at my quarterback list trying to think of. I mean, like, you could have like a Will Levis or a Bryce Young really hit this year in a way that brings them back into this question, but neither of us predicted that. JJ McCarthy, I guess. Is there anyone else that stood out to you as near misses?
I don't think so. From the perspective that you have to really like QBs to not be making a mistake in pushing them in a lot of formats. And so for me, again, it's kind of the structural idea where that next group you want to push down. And that does mean pushing down someone like a Brock Purdy who has a super high floor. It does mean pushing down someone like a Jared Goff who, I made the case when I was discussing why I still do have fairly aggressive ranks on the Detroit Lions players projecting for next year, that Goff could set career highs. If he sets career highs, he's going to score in a range that makes him very viable here. So I think that you have to consider him. I also wonder about Bo Nix as a rusher, because if he does what he did in 2022, then he ends up being pretty viable.
Yeah.
In 2023, he was able to run the offense so effectively, get the ball out so fast, put up so many points that they didn't need him to run. And if you don't need him to run, you also don't want him getting hurt, right? And one of the things that he's actually done is, like, he more or less just goes down. And so you need to have open space for him to run into. Even though he probably has the ability to evade tackles, he chooses to protect himself. And so from that perspective, you lose the chance at some of these big plays. We already saw in the first preseason game, though, how, if you add just a couple of decent runs in a game, and then you have that potential to rush for touchdowns, which he has done before.
Yeah.
I just want to be careful about my Bo Nix looks at things. People are really like, the rankings you've given us don't show any caution whatsoever. Why would you draw the line here? I'm going to draw the line in front of Bo Nix.
Yeah. I mean, my thought on him is that he's going to have a low ADOT. He's going to complete a lot of underneath passes, and I think he's going to accumulate passing yards and eventually have the potential to be a pretty good passing point type of fantasy quarterback. But I think in year one, especially, I think we're going to see the spike games, Shawn, and we're going to see some downfield passing. We're going to see a little bit of mobility with it, and it's going to make him actually have some spike games. That's why I have a ton of him in best ball. The way I envision it is we also have some floor games from him where it's not a lot of rushing, plus a more of an underneath passing profile where he throws for like 210 yards. And if the TDs don't come in either, and there's not a lot of rushing, it's just kind of a boring game. And then at the end of the year, you're looking at it like kind of a boring scoring season because there's a lot of these low ADOT, low yards per attempt games in there, which is one of the things that people mention about his preseason. He played quite a bit, and his yards per attempt wasn't like, through the roof or anything. His downfield passing wasn't fantastic, though he did make a couple good throws. That was overstated. I mean, I think the roll into the left one
missed in a way that if that catch is made and the
De'Ami
Brown catch,
one. Yes.
Right. So like you get a very different look at those two guys if the Knicks one is caught and the Daniels one is dropped.
That was a well-thrown ball. No one wanted to talk about that, but you're right. I also the
which
third
again
down
I'm glad because we don't need
the
ADP to go. I mean, I want to see him against a real defense. The Colts might as well not have been on the field. I mean, they made Tyler Beatty and Blake Watson, and again, this is the end of the game, but they made those guys look like priority targets for every single team that doesn't have already 3 good running backs. I mean, you could put like their top 6 in the Hall of Fame after that game. We're still not seeing real football.
Yeah, that's true. I was going to say that the other throw I really loved is the one where he's rolling to his left on the first drive, and while moving left on a third down, hit Cortland Sutton right on the sideline in a very nice throw. I mean, for a guy moving to his left, converts a big third down. That was at least like a 18-yard gain or something like that.
There are all types of analysts who have a lot more experience scouting QBs, obviously, than I do, who have some questions. The thing I haven't been able to understand as it relates to Knicks and the scouting concerns is that you have the raw numbers and the peripherals, which were really good. Now, good as someone who was old compared to his competition. You never want to completely forget that. But the other thing is that when you watch him, he makes all of these off-platform throws that not that many QBs can make. And so it's a question of, how many of those throws are inaccurate or could lead to turnovers. But then you look at the actual results and like, well, it hasn't led to those things on the field for Oregon. It was a problem maybe more when he was at Auburn. As you mentioned, that ability to move and throw is something we don't see a lot of guys. Right. And so it's this weird deal where you're the number 12 pick. Most people think you should have been drafted in round 4 or 5, but you can make that kind of throw. It doesn't all sync up for me.
Yeah, well, I saw one thread that broke down even his performance in this game, which I thought was fine because he threw a lot of accurate passes, but it was really focused on his feet and the fact that he's bailing from clean pockets and moving around in those things. And he's like, you can't do this. You can't move into this clean pocket. Like, you can't move in here. Like, well, there's no reason to be bailing here. But on a lot of the scenarios, it was him kind of moving off a spot, but then throwing accurately while moving a little bit. And then I saw, I think it was Hayden Winks from Underdog Fantasy mentioning like that's the way he played at Oregon. Like not in direct disagreement to that, but in his own analysis that like he's got kind of happy feet in the pocket, throws off platform a little bit, but that's his style. Like that's what he did in the college film too. And you mentioned the stats are all there. It's not great, but like, I mean, that was something that like even like Peyton Manning did a lot. He would move around a lot in the pocket. And it would almost feel like he was like doing this like choppy, happy foot thing at times, like especially later in his career. It's like he wanted to be not off platform, but not like just stationary so a guy could blindside him and he'd fumble. It was like he wanted to be like an athletic, moving. For Nick, some of it is, you're bailing out of pockets. Yeah, you're fading off your back foot instead of putting some power into some throws. I understand there's concerns. But as you said, like the numbers and the way that he played in college, it actually manifested. I think a lot of that's over. The person that was talking about him bailing on his clean pockets and all that stuff was basically saying that his game was horrible. And it's like, well, I don't think you can say that either. The yards per attempt wasn't great. Like I said, the accuracy was fine. Completion percentage, very good. All the underneath stuff that they set up, they threw downfield early. Then they threw underneath for like 3 more drives and they had 4 scoring drives. And that's exactly what I think that their offense is going to be. And exactly why I think that Bo Nix is going to start week 1. Sean Payton wants to take some shots downfield and then throw underneath 500 times.
Yeah, you mentioned the bailing out of clean pockets. One of their stats I saw, which I don't know if it's correct, but just that his time to throw was super low. And so, again, there's this disconnect between the things that he is accomplishing that are great, in that if you're going to throw underneath, you want it to be because you immediately had the read and you executed the play, not because you couldn't find anybody. You sit around for a while and then you don't throw it anywhere and you have a low 8 out because of that. But the other thing is that when you don't have some of those things, you'd love for the guy to actually get out of the pocket, where then you have the scramble throw option, because again, we do want him to scramble and get scramble yards. I mean, that part is what really rounds out the fantasy portion of the profile. We'll see. Again,
we'll see.
The Colts weren't putting up much of a.
No. But May's the one that, Sean, we should have had on here. Hat tip to our buddy Pat Crane. He'd be sad. I'll say that I actually left May in at 212 just to give, because he's got the profile. If he hits, Pat consistently mentions it, and we talked about it with some of these other players. He is willing to be aggressive downfield, and he's also more mobile than he gets credit for. That's what we talked about with all the guys that we were excited about, right? The ability to push downfield and scramble a little bit. May probably should be in this discussion, unless you think he just has a really bad rookie season. It's a tough situation in New England. That's what I keep emphasizing when I talk about the Patriots. They're projected to score a league low total number of points in the look-ahead lines. A lot of people would say, well, we're Houston projected to score last year before CJ Stroud changed the whole outlook of their offense. So you can make a lot of different types of cases. I do think you want to be careful with that because Houston.
Yeah, I don't know that we have any
Stroud.
Player in recent memory, really, that, I mean, in retrospect, that there are some guys where maybe the situation had a huge range of outcomes, in part because you actually know what outcome happened, and you're like, well, it was different than what we thought. But, I mean, with May, he could start week 1, he could start week 15, he could be good, he could be awful. I mean, some of the numbers from this last year are not great, and so in some ways, you would just prefer the Will Levis profile where he's actually going to be playing. And so you're going to get to see those numbers, on the scoreboard, right? Now, the profile is similar, which is the reason I emphasize it is the profile itself isn't going to do it. You actually have to be able to play some too. That's why we're not really on Will Levis. There were a lot of concerns for me in terms of what Drake May had done from a profile perspective. But again, he was one of the guys I did have in that rookie 101 series. I would now have him gap back. But the reason that I wrote about him is that there were some really cool things in his numbers as well. Yeah, I mean, anytime that you have someone that gives you those Josh Allen echoes, certainly can't ignore it.
Definitely, Sean, this has been a blast. We went long on this topic, which I mean was always inevitably gonna happen. It's my favorite show every year. It's the listeners' favorite show every year. This is just such a blast that we get a chance to do this stuff. Thank you to everyone who listens and tunes in and who loves this show and has asked for this show for weeks. And honestly, I think I heard about it first at least a month ago. So it's a fun one to put together. We had a really fun time discussing it. Thank you all for listening.
And that'll do it for the full audio of Stealing Bananas. I'm Shawn Siegele. With me, as always, is Ben Gretch. You can follow at Yards Per Gretch, Stealing Signals, Stealing Lines, the new Stealing Signals YouTube. Ben, I'm really excited. I haven't completely gotten, your full okay or plan, but I'm hoping to draft quite a few FFPC big teams with you on that in the next 3 weeks, whatever it is that we have left at this point. Also, you mentioned some of those great write-ups that you've had, including the Home League write-up. I know everybody's going to want to get over. And if they haven't, for some unfathomable reason, subscribe to Stealing Signals so they get your analysis as they head into their most important drafts. We would also love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code there is RVRadio2024 at checkout. That gets you 10% off your 1-year subscription. Gets you access to all those tools. We've got fantastic writers like Jake and Matt and Michael and Connor, Kevin, 20 more people that I am not mentioning because I'm trying to blow through it. I think you'll enjoy that. And again, the training camp discount is on there, so you get a double discount if you use that coupon code. That'll be it for Stealing Bananas. Leave us a rating and review. That helps with the algorithm. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.